Dear viewer, and perhaps a student, here is the last mini lecture on the module circulation in this part of the course. This lecture is about the concept of symmorphosis, and it's highly tied with the previous lecture, number 8, in which we looked at the concept of VO2 max and the challenges to the cardiovascular system. And you'll recognize some slides from this presentation that were already presented in the previous one, so I strongly encourage to view the previous lecture if you want to follow closely and understand this one. Symmorphosis as a principle of optimal design. And here is what we were discussing in the previous lecture in the context of oxygen transport in the body of any organism as occurring as a set of steps. In here we are describing it as a set of 4 steps, starting with the ventilation in the respiratory system, continuing with diffusion at the level of the gas exchanger, the lungs or the tissues, transport in the circulation, and finally the oxygen used in cellular metabolism. And in the previous lecture, what I presented was the case of how these different steps in oxygen transport relate to a situation of maximal oxygen transport, such as exercise in humans. And in that occasion, I was telling you that the limiting step in the oxygen transport cascade during exercise in humans was actually located through the circulatory system. But there are some other potential scenarios in an alternative aerobic challenge, or the same one as exercise in different animals. And then what we could have is a situation in which the different steps appearing here, one of them is more limiting than the others may be matching to each other. An alternative scenario would be one in which all the different steps match to each other. And this scenario is particularly appealing because it would reflect an optimization of the system. If all the steps of the oxygen transport cascade are matched to each other at the time of maximal need, we would have an optimized design. The structures involved in these processes, the functions, the physiology involved here, would not be in excess in terms of carrying this maximal oxygen. And this is what essentially Ewell, Weibel and Rich Taylor proposed when they coined the term symmorphosis, which actually means balance formation. In their original definition, Weibel and Taylor described symmorphosis as a state of structural design commensurate to functional needs. In other words, structure and function match each other, whereby the formation of structural elements is regulated to satisfy but not exceed the requirements of the functional system. So Weibel and Taylor are proposing that in biology, in physiology, the construction of a given system is actually designed in order to match its maximum capability. And notice that this is a principle that is particularly applicable to the oxygen cascade, as we revised in the previous lecture. In their Symmorphosis book, basically they envision symmorphosis as a universal principle in the design of biological systems. And they made an analogy to an engineering situation that you can read here, but I'm not going to describe. Essentially, their point is that the same way that an engineer will build a system, a machine, with the proper structural elements for the function that is desired, and will try to do that in the most economic and efficient way, the proposal is that biology, natural selection in this case, will do the same. If some of the elements built in a machine or in the body are expensive and do not serve a purpose, one would expect these construction to take place in a different way. This is designed to be done differently. This is what Weibel and Taylor basically proposed and wanted to test experimentally. And in this case, I just remind you of what I described in the previous lecture, in which during exercise in humans, it is circulation that is the limiting step. It is the circulation, the cardiovascular system, the one that is limiting maximal oxygen transport. So at least in one case, in one species, it does not seem to be valid. But of course, Symmorphosis was not defined for that purpose, but instead, it was proposed as a new empirical ground to look at the principle of optimal design, in this case in relation to oxygen transportation. Not looking at one species, but looking at across a specific species. Specifically, they aim to test whether maximum function measured as a VO2 max is a fixed ratio of the structure in the mammalian respiratory system. So they focused the study to study the mammalian respiratory systems in multiple species across orders to see if they find evidence of this match between structure and function in oxygen transport. Their purpose is that if, as they hypothesized, all mammals maintain a fixed ratio between function, in the form of VO2 max, and the various structural elements involved in oxygen transport, optimal design could be demonstrated. And they set up to test this hypothesis using an extensive set of tools that can be summarized down to this level, in which the oxygen transport across each one of the steps in the oxygen cascade is actually represented by a given function that includes all the elements affecting oxygen transport in that step. I'm not going to get into the details of these four equations. The point is that each one of these equations narrows down to a measurement that can provide information, a structural measurement that can provide information on the transport capability across every single one of these steps. If we consider at the level of the ventilation, the respiratory system, the key parameter to look at here is the pulmonary diffusion capacity of the lung for oxygen. And the authors set up to measure this. As a second step in the circulation, it has to do with the number of erythrocytes and the stroke volume of the heart in a parameter that they combine, and they call it erythrocyte stroke volume, the capability of the blood of the cardiovascular system to transport oxygen. At the level of the tissues, in terms of providing oxygen to the tissues, we are mainly talking about an exercise condition. Therefore, the authors are interested in looking at muscle capillary density, because it's the capillaries, the ones that distribute blood nutrients to all the different cells. So by looking at the density of the capillaries in the muscle, it could provide an idea of the maximum transport of oxygen in the muscle. And finally, at the tissue, at the cellular level, we are looking at mitochondrial density. The density of mitochondria, or the total actually amount of mitochondria in a skeletal muscle. The authors engage in a tremendous effort to quantify these four structural parameters across a range of many vertebrate species. And I'm not going to have time to summarize all the numerous papers that appeared in that. I'll just simply summarize it in one single slide. And this slide is showing you two of the steps in particular. In this case, I'm showing you number 1 and number 4. I'm not showing the other two, but you have to believe me that number 2 and 3 basically line up, or are very similar to number 2, the primary number 4, mitochondrial density. So what they plot is across the whole range of mammalian body masses, from an animal that is 10 grams to an animal that is 1,000 kilos, 1 ton. They look at maximal oxygen consumption, and they look at these structural parameters I described, and what they see is that basically mitochondrial density, but also capillary density of the muscle, erythrocyte stroke volume, are or provide basically align well with the allometric equation for VO2 max. But the diffusion capacity of the lung for oxygen does not. Notice that the slope of this line for the diffusion pulmonary capacity is much higher than it is for VO2 max mitochondrial density. Therefore, matching between function and structure apparently occurs in all steps except in the first one, in the ventilation at the level of the lung. And that in itself kills the idea that Symmorphosis could be used as a principle of universal design, because we don't see evidence of this full matching. If we want to interpret these results in the context of Symmorphosis, we would have to say that the lungs, the respiratory system, is designed in excess capacity, as I already mentioned in the previous lecture about exercising humans, where the lungs are also designed with excess capacity. So although the Symmorphosis principle does not seem to apply, and there was a tremendous amount of work, one cannot resign to actually look at this problem closely, and because the idea is so appealing, to look at this idea closely, instead now of looking at across the species, to just pay attention to one single species. And that would be a situation where an animal has been heavily selected for one particular purpose. And this is the case of the thoroughbred horse. Could Symmorphosis instead apply to a single species that has been subjected to intense selection programs? The thoroughbred horse has been. Arguments in favor for that basically have to do with the fact that winning times in races in the last decade have not improved after many years of constant improvement, suggesting that these animals now have reached a ceiling in terms of performance and capability. There doesn't seem to be a possibility to improve this anymore. And this actually also aligns with the well-provided evidence that in races some animals will experience severe problems associated with hypoventilation, hypoxemia, lowered oxygenation of the blood, high hematocrits, rupture of pulmonary blood vessels. So all of these indicating that the system is working at maximum capacity and that the safety margins for functionality basically are being crossed all the time, resulting in abnormal pathologies or even the fact that animals have to be sacrificed. Looking at this particular question, researchers engaged in doing a study looking at horses, and in this case they decided to compare these with steers. One could argue why this comparison, but that's in this case what the authors did. And what they engaged in doing is what happens to the different cardiorespiratory variables when these animals run on treadmills. The first slide shows you VO2, oxygen consumption, and basically VO2 max reaching at the end. What you see clearly is that the steers, these are the open symbols, do not reach the same amount or the same levels of VO2 of oxygen consumption in form of VO2 max as thoroughbred horses do. Basically, thoroughbred horses go more than double the VO2 max and can actually run at much higher speed, close to 9 meters per second. So, in this case, VO2 max is 2.6 times higher in race horses than it is in actually steers. What explains this improved performance in horses? Well, when you compare the different cardiovascular parameters, cardiac output, heart rate, stroke volume, and arterial pressure and resistance, what jumps clearly to your eyes is that, one, there are no differences in heart rate while the animal is exercising. Notice that these comparisons are done now of a ratio to VO2 max. So when the animals reach VO2 max, even if this VO2 max is lower, how is that reached? Notice the heart rates are basically on top of each other, there's no difference. The big difference has to do with stroke volume. Stroke volume, that means much higher cardiac output. In this case, the numbers say that basically it's double So the change in heart size, in stroke volume, in cardiac output explains the doubling of VO2 max. But notice that VO2 max increased by 2.6 times. This is only explaining double. What else explains the difference? Well, in this case, oxygen consumption is a function of cardiac output and also the arteriovenous difference. And if you compare both the species again across the range of different ratios of VO2 max, what you see is that in horses you have a larger arteriovenous difference. And this larger arteriovenous difference accounts for a 1.3-fold change, explaining the main difference between steers and horses. So that means that we have actually characterized at the level of the cardiovascular system and see where are the differences between horses and steers. And we can, of course, do the same at the level of the respiratory system. And essentially, again, we have a twofold change in the diffusive capacity of the lung. The diffusing capacity of the lung in horses has doubled. Therefore, you have also, that explains also this increase in oxygen, maximal oxygen consumption. The remaining change in the respiratory capability for transporting oxygen, this 1.3-fold greater, actually resides at the level of how the blood equilibrates in its transit through the lung. And what you could see for these graphs is basically in the steer lung, full oxygenation is reached before it's done in the horse. So the horse has a larger capability for loading. There is also more blood here, there is more red blood cells. So it actually, but by the time that it reaches the end of the capillary network in the lung, it is fully saturated. Or it's actually not fully saturated, but close to, in comparison with the steer lung. So this would explain exactly the other 1.3-fold. Essentially, therefore, this study tells us how racehorses may have actually benefited from this selection program, reaching the maximum. Does that tell us something about Symmorphosis? Well, relatively speaking, yes, but in reality it cannot prove anything. And this is what Jones concludes in its review paper, looking at Symmorphosis at this particular species. His conclusion is essentially that strong selection for aerobic power in horses has maximized most of the structures in the system, in this case increasing diffusion capacity in the lung, increasing also heart size, until the least malleable structure, the lungs, becomes a major limitation for oxygen. So what happens here, presumably, is that during the selection process, the artificial selection for horses, there's been a dramatic improvement in the capability of the cardiovascular system to transport oxygen. There's been an improvement also in the diffusing capacity in the lung, but not in the total capability of the lung to transport oxygen. Therefore, now it's the lung that has become limiting and preventing for reaching higher or improvements in the oxygen transport capacity. Obviously, Symmorphosis cannot determine the optimization in this design when we are looking at one single species. Finally, the concept of Symmorphosis, I would say, and I think that this is the great contribution Symmorphosis has done into physiology, is that it has given us a theoretical framework, a hypothetical framework, that on which we could actually look at oxygen transportation. So that in itself has been extremely beneficial, even if there is little evidence that Symmorphosis, as this universal principle of design, in particular in terms of describing the matching of oxygen in the cardiorespiratory system, does not appear to be true. And of course, we can actually look into many different reasons for refusing Symmorphosis, from basic, simple evolutionary theory, but because, in the first place, environments are always changing, so an animal cannot accommodate to a single situation, but it has to cope with multiple varying environments. Genetic drift is also an important factor in determining how populations change. Biological materials have limitations, and they are related to their own stories. So it's not that everything is possible in biology. The animal has to come up with improvements based on the structure it already has, and it has to keep being functional. And finally, of course, and perhaps the most important, is that one cannot look at isolated systems in the body. We are looking at the cardiorespiratory system in the horse. We see a tremendous improvement, but we have to consider how important everything is integrated for the fact that this animal has to perform at its maximal capability. One detail in this context: the lungs, the respiratory system, is heavily subjected to the stress, to the mechanical stress of galloping. When the animal is galloping, there is mechanical stress from the legs transmitted to the rest of the body into the lung. These stressors are limiting lung capacity. And these stressors are necessary in order to improve performance, running speed, running and performance and endurance. Therefore, there's a point in which the mechanical effort associated with running, with locomotion, will have an impact on respiration. And that has to be taken into account if we want to optimize this again. And that's it for me. That's it for this module circulation series. And it's time to just wrap it up. Thank you very much.